My sister and I were staying in an old historic hotel in the middle of nowhere in Montana. The building had been in use since the 1800s. My sister loves this place and has frequented it many times over the years. Well, I was kept up all night by someone pacing around on the hardwood floors in the room above ours. Drove me crazy. In the morning, I asked my sister how she could sleep through all the racket, and she told me that the upstairs of the building actually used to be a ballroom, but now it's carpeted and empty. The hotel staff confirmed that nobody was ever up there, and furthermore, if they were, I wouldn't have ever heard heels on hardwood floor. My family traveled to the south of France to stay in a cottage owned by someone my dad worked with. The owners visited occasionally, but that summer it was free and we had 10 days booked in there. After a long 2 days on the road, we drove down a steep driveway towards a secluded mill cottage, with the water wheel sat static alongside the stone house. There was a deep cellar with stone stairs down under the wheel next to the house, and a small river circled the entire place. We went into the house and chose rooms, but being set down in a small copse, the house was draught and cold from lack of use. We settled in and turned all of the heating on, yet the house remained cold and felt damp. The first night we had set a fire in the living room and listened to a couple of audiobooks before my sister and I went to sleep. My parents stayed up just a little longer, then they went to bed. Around midnight, they both woke up at exactly the same time, and the door to their bedroom was opening slowly. At first, they thought it was my sister until they saw a large, dark silhouette of a man framed in the doorway, standing stock still, just looking in their direction, as if appraising them. After a short period, the shape turned and started to move, as if satisfied, and then disappeared. They looked at each other, but didn't speak, and, well, both went back to sleep. The next morning, the house felt pretty warm and dry, and sunlight was back through the windows, as if something had been lifted and even accepted them. They spoke the next day and both agreed that although they were skeptics, it could not have been anything other than something supernatural in that doorway, deciding their worth. So, I used to live at an address that will remain unknown for the sake of this story. The houses were built to house the people building the railway in the Derby in the 1800s. I only found this out after I left the house, thankfully. It was a creepy house, really foreboding, and every time I washed my hair in the shower, every time I opened my eyes, I expected something just to be there. Anyway, I came back from an afternoon lecture one afternoon, opened the door, walked up to the first flight of stairs, and saw a wet handprint on the floor. A really wet handprint. I was a bit like, that's pretty strange at that moment, but I didn't freak out. It was just out of the ordinary. So I walked up to see my housemate, Ed. I opened the door and he was on the phone to his girlfriend, not crying, but massively in distress. That was when the penny dropped. He then told me that as he was walking up the stairs earlier, carrying a glass of water, he felt something cold just go right through him, almost like a push, causing him to drop the water. He picked up the glass and ran upstairs to his room. Now, the water falling out of the glass had created a handprint on the floor. Literally, a handprint. Every digit was in proportion. I did freak out at that moment as I'd put two and two together. I told everyone to get out of the house, which we did, but then sheepishly returned after a FIFA session around another friend's house. You know, it was just so genuinely terrifying. It might not sound it, but it was. When I was a kid, we lived in a haunted house. Strange things happened all the time. For example, my dad and I were alone in the kitchen one day making a snack. We put a plate on the kitchen counter and walked away to the fridge. We got what we wanted out of the fridge, turned around to walk back to the counter, and the plate flew off the kitchen counter and broke on the floor. My dad tried to calm me by saying the plate must have been blown off the counter, but let's face it, the plate wasn't near the edge of the counter and there was no windows or doors open. There was no way wind could have came through and did that. Besides, no one else was even home. It was super weird. I also woke up to an old lady standing by bed on more than one occasion. I told myself I was just dreaming. This part might be dark, but here's the rest of the story. Years later, I looked up the address and found that an old couple lived there for many years right before we actually moved in. Apparently, the house was broken into and an old woman was raped and murdered. The old man sold the house and moved, but we were the first occupants since that incident. We only lived there for about a year, but my parents swear we moved so quickly because we got a better deal on another house nearby, but we knew it was because the house was haunted and the priest they brought in to bless the place told them that we should move. No joke. Okay, get ready for this story. So, I was closing up the bar one night after a long shift, and as I was carrying a rack of glasses into the kitchen, I slipped on the wet floor I had just mopped, fell to the floor, and let out an instinctual "ah!" Immediately after, as I'm sitting on the wet floor, I hear a low-pitched moan. It was so audible that I actually thought it was a real person. This was startling considering I was the only person left in the whole bar. I stood up, completely frozen, and yelled, "Hello?" But again, immediately I hear the same low-pitched moan, except this time it was louder. Now I'm starting to freak out a little bit, but for whatever reason, I decided to walk closer to where I heard the sound coming from, and I hear very loudly, "Hello?" For the third time, I now hear a very loud, low-pitched moan. That was it for me. I ran back into the kitchen, grabbed the biggest kitchen knife I could find, because, that seemed logical at the time. I grabbed my purse and I ran out the door, and I never once looked back. It was funny trying to explain to the chef the next day why he was missing a knife during his morning prep, but the creepiest part, I come to find out that there was some sort of accident that had occurred in the restaurant years before, with apparently the son of the owner, and word around town was that he died right there in the bar. My house was fraught with weird stuff happening when we first moved in. The kitchen table would move overnight, 12 to 18 inches easily. My keys will disappear and show up in the weirdest places, like my quilt trunk. Now, my son Christopher had went into the basement and things came flying off the shelf at him. He also saw someone walking on our wraparound porch once, but no one was there apparently. Now, the most obvious one was a few years ago, and twice this happened. I was sweeping the kitchen floor. The door to the porch started shaking uncontrollably. It was like someone was trying to open the door without turning the knob, and it lasted about 15 seconds. Now keep in mind, this is a wraparound porch, so it's completely enclosed. I know it was bad because my dogs, who will bark at a butterfly flying past the window, they all looked up at the door and basically just stepped back. Both times it happened, I was doing the same thing about the same time. But to add a side note, I walked into the kitchen table one night while going to the bathroom. It was not the first time I walked into the kitchen table because it was moved. So I just said, "Please stop moving the kitchen table." And well, it never moved again.